is on. So welcome. I hope you all enjoyed a wonderful evening last night. And it's my pleasure to introduce Alex Sandy Pentland to you. He's the Toshiba professor at MIT. He's really, I think, the face of big data. He has an amazing history here as an entrepreneur, as a founder of the MIT Media Lab. He was really a pioneer in image and facial recognition. If you haven't had a chance to read his book, Social Physics, that's something you should definitely have a look at. It's a really quite an amazing piece of work. He's done very important work for the World Economic Forum. You can see he's an advisory board on many advisory boards. In economics, he's what we call a leading indicator. He seems to be doing things far before anybody else has realized they're really interesting, and it'll be quite fun to see what he has in store for us today. So take it away, Alex.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. So I wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, I redid my entire presentation after seeing the things yesterday. I figured, oh, okay, I've got to do it. Give the big picture here. So one thing is that this Institute for Data Systems and Society, so MIT, speaking of leading indicators, has sort of gotten with it and decided that computational social science is a good thing and set up this new institute within MIT. So it's an institute in the institute that cuts across all departments and all schools. And they've committed at this point 15 new faculty lines to it. And if you know anything about faculty lines, this is like, oh my God, right? And the reason is that they think that there's a broad sense that thinking about things in terms of networks and particularly social systems, which is everything from power grids through transportation through government, is really sort of what MIT believes is going to be one of the really big themes for the next century. So, you know, if you're looking for a job, there'll be postdocs, there'll be faculty positions, send students our way. We're just getting started. Just thought I'd mention that. And I just want to also mention that I sit on the advisory boards for many different institutions, which gives me sort of an unusual perspective on where things go, and I'll try and mention that as we go along. So the first thing I want to do is start with this. This is a quote from Adam Smith about the invisible hand. And everybody knows this quote. This is really an important quote because this is the way our society is governed. We have markets, we have incentives for individuals. We usually think of managing things this way, so democracy, one man, one vote, that sort of thing, all around this notion that individuals striving by themselves, making decisions by themselves, more or less rationally, somehow discovered the best solutions to things. But this is not from his economics work. This is not from The Wealth of Nations. This is from Moral Sentiments. And if you look at a more typical quote from Moral Sentiment, it says, the reason that the invisible hand works, it's human nature to exchange not only goods, but ideas, assistance, and favors. And it's these exchanges that cause society to create solution for the good of the community. So what he's saying, put in a sort of a mathematical framework, is that most of the way we have dealt with people and governance and incentives is a sort of first-order approximation. The first-order approximation is we're a bunch of individuals. Let's ask about how incentive mechanisms change individual behavior. But the second-order thing is the relationships between people, the exchanges between people. And those have largely been left out of our thinking about governance and about incentives. So we're really networks of people, is what Adam Smith is saying here. And when you do the sort of solutions that you would like to do that incorporate these second-order relationships between people, you sometimes get very different solutions than you do when you treat things in the sort of classic individual way. And I think that's the biggest message here is that most of the way we design things is based on this first-order approximation that we're individuals, and we make up our minds by ourselves, but in fact, as you've heard here, that's simply not true. So some years ago, I decided to look into this because it seemed to me that this was the interesting place for economics to go. And I wanted to do something that's very different than what you've heard most of the talks so far. Most of the talks so far have been huge data sets, perhaps some of them over long periods of time, but they're not very dense. So the famous Framingham Heart Study, which you can see contagion for obesity, happiness, things like that. 30 years, 30,000 people, but they make about one measurement a month on average because people come in to participate in the study only once every couple years. Similarly, these big phone networks or big Facebook sort of networks, they're wonderful, they're huge, but they don't actually know the context in which the people live. They do know what the people say they do. They don't know what they actually do, and they certainly don't know their physical day-to-day reality. So I determined to build measurement tools that would give a very dense measurement of people's day-to-day actual behavior, as well as what they said they were doing. So the subjective as well as the objective. And I built like these little sociometers, which measure all sorts of things, where you are, your body language, your tone of voice, who's speaking. And then you do a variety of other things on top of that, like you look at performance statistics for groups, and you give them all the sort of classic social science and sociology surveys. And so we began this sort of around 2001. Building on my earlier work on wearable computing. And we discovered many things. One of the things is we discovered that we needed to have a mathematical framework for taking into account these second-order effects. And the main one that I chose was based on hidden Markov models or Markov decision processes. But the moment you try to model groups of people using this, you discover that you have way too many parameters to actually do anything. It would take you years of observation to be able to characterize a particular situation. But if you do a simple simplification, which is that you model influence as being dyadic. So the influence on me is the sum of the influence of all of you individually on me, as opposed to the combinations of all your states. You get the log of the total number of states, which means suddenly you can begin doing machine learning for all of the parameters, and you can discover the conditional probabilities between people in terms of their actions. So we observe people, we look at conditional dependencies, and from that we infer internal states. And this simplification has a lot of good mathematical properties. The main one from a practical point of view is you get very fast, stable estimates of both internal state of the person, but also of the network of social relationships without having to ask anything. You simply observe behavior and look for conditional dependencies. So just to say that as sort of a top-level sort of framework. So what are some of the things we did? Well, there was a paper in Science a couple of years ago that has been one of these ones that really takes off. It's part of the psychology canon, as they call it. Basically looking at patterns of interactions between hundreds of groups of people solving lots of different types of problems. And what we discovered is that there's a pattern that relates to group performance that's a lot like IQ, like intelligence quotient. And we called it collective intelligence or collective intelligence quotient. It accounts for about 40% of the group's performance across tasks. So it's about the same magnitude as IQ. And what it is it has to do with the efficiency of transferring ideas within the group. The pattern of communication, independent of the task, independent of the people, independent of their IQ, independent of their personality, determines about 40% of the performance of a group. So a group like this, where there's a couple of dominant people and a couple of people that aren't doing much, is a low performance group. A group like this is a high performance group, where there are much more even contributions from everybody. There's a couple of other things that go into it, but interestingly, not the IQ of the individuals, that was not a significant factor, and not the content, just the pattern. So it's the efficiency of communication, of clearing ideas out of people's heads, that determine this huge chunk of performance. We've gone on and done this for larger organizations, so this is a bank, where the blue stuff here is all the email and electronic communication, and the red is the face-to-face communication, again, using these little badges. Right? And what you see here is a creative group that's designing an ad campaign. And what the red is showing is how people meet up in the hall, around the coffee pot. And most of that communication is, in fact, not official communication. It's stuff that happens in the hall, happens around lunch, happens around the coffee pot. Only part of it is official communication. And yet it's the face-to-face stuff, just as with a science paper, it's the face-to-face stuff that determines about 40% of the performance statistic for these organizations. And we've done some dozens of organizations now. So again, not the content, not the IQ, not the personality, not the things you usually think of, and not the electronics communication, too, interestingly. But the pattern of face-to-face communication, most of it casual conversation. This clearing of ideas, setting of context, this sort of ad hoc serendipitous stuff seems to be the single largest factor in the performance of these groups. You can do the same thing with phones, and we've built a lot of software over the years to be able to do this. So download it into, first we built our own phones. We had these, PDAs that we put Wi-Fi in, and, because there weren't any smartphones. And later when smartphones came available, we did some of the first things with that, the reality mining thing with Nathan Eagle, for instance. And it turns out you can measure a lot of the same things with that, not quite the same. But again, the idea was dense measurement. And so what I began doing is picking communities around MIT where I would sign up everybody in the community, which is a very difficult thing to do, to get almost everybody. And I would give them all phones, look at their behavior, their communication, where they were, who they spent time with, their Facebook account, their email account, their credit cards. We did health measurements on them. We looked at their electroencephalograms at night. We also asked them every social science survey and every sociology survey we could think of. So these poor guys were really tortured, but they were paid pretty well too. And so from that, we got these year-long what we call social fMRI experiments, where we could look at all the patterns of communication, all the sorts of behavioral variables that you want to do at once, very dense sorts of measurements, and began to discover things that were interesting. So one of the first ones that will be relevant later here is it turned out that you could identify friendship patterns. So people that weren't friends, people that were friends, mutual friends. And interestingly, there's a large class of people where the friendship goes one way. Now, this is not something we normally think of, and if you think about the analyses that you see up here or read about, most of them say, here's the friendship network, and it's not a directed network. But in fact, friendships are directed. And as you'll see, more than half of them are unidirectional, not bidirectional. So when you do the analysis, having just a static friendship network, you've done it wrong. You want to think about that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Another thing that we discovered is that people had characteristic responses that seemed to be things that are essentially biological responses to stress. So, for instance, when people were coming down with the flu, they changed their pattern of communication and mobility. And they did it in a systematic way across people, and you could use that as a detector for flu. You could tell them when they were getting depressed because they had a different characteristic change of behavior. And this got turned into a spin-off company, and the CTO, Chief Technical Officer of the United States, said, this is an innovation that will save our health system. The reason he said that is that today's health systems are based on acute care. So you wait till the person gets sick enough that they end their health care. And by that time, they're really quite sick. What you'd like to do is detect when they're getting sick. So you'd like to have a check engine light on people so that you know who to reach out to have proactive health care. It makes a huge difference in health care costs, on the order of magnitude. And that's what Ginger is attempting to do. Its largest funder is Kaiser Permanente, which is the largest vertically integrated health system in the United States. So those are some of the things that we discovered. But if you remember at the beginning, I was interested primarily in these second-order things between people and the notions of incentives and the notions of how we govern ourselves. So traditionally, we think about these things. And my personal motivation is, over the last decade, I've gone to Davos, with the World Economic Forum almost every year. And you see these world leaders, and the only thing they ever talk about when they talk about behavior change is individual incentives, market incentives. And they're ignoring the social fabric that they have in these populations that they want to deal with. And I thought this was sort of an enormous problem. And we had done a number of things where what we had done is, instead of motivating things purely by economic incentives, we had motivated social networks. So we had tried to activate these peer-to-peer relationships rather than the individuals themselves. So a classic example is the Red Balloon Challenge that DARPA put out, the 40th anniversary of the Internet Challenge, which we won. So several hundred teams competed in this. DARPA hid 10 balloons somewhere in the United States. All the teams, save one, did the same thing. They used economic incentives. If you reported a balloon to them, they would give you some money. And we did something very different based on this notion of second-order peer-to-peer relationships. We did indeed reward people for seeing a balloon, but we also rewarded them for recruiting additional people. So if you saw a balloon, I'd give you $2,000. If you recruited him and he saw the balloon, you get $2,000, but you get $1,000 for recruiting him. If you recruit him, he sees it, he gets $2,000, you get $1,000, you get $500. If you work it out, it's to your advantage to recruit as many of your friends as possible, and particularly if they're spatially distributed. And what we found is that in a period a little more than 24 hours, we were able to recruit what we estimate as something like 2 million people. And we're able to get reports about all the balloons in something around 4 hours. And then there was another 5 hours of trying to figure out who was lying to us, because it turns out there were also hundreds of teams that were spamming people. But in the end, we won it. And so the idea there is that it's not direct rewards, it's peer-to-peer rewards that allowed us to grow the network. It's a very different thing than centralized incentives. We've done the same thing, this is a little temporarily out of line. For instance, in Switzerland, there's a canton that's mostly hydroelectric power. Above that, they have diesel. They wanted to keep the power consumption below in the hydroelectric range, because diesel is very expensive and dirty. And they had tried educating people and giving economic incentives, and it hadn't really worked. And we talked them into doing an experiment where they signed people up with buddies. And what would happen is, if you saved energy, your buddies would make money. Okay, not you, your buddies. Again, incenting the social relationship to apply peer pressure on people. In this case, the rewards for giving your buddy, giving your friend a hard time and telling them they should save energy with these little dancing marmots, which are the state animal for the canton. They're worth about a dime. And at a budget of about 50 cents per person per week, we were able to get 17% reduction in electricity use in that canton. And that's a really huge number if you look at conventional experiments in this area. Normally, you'd expect that you would have had to double the price of the electricity to get this same sort of thing that we were able to achieve at 50 cents per person per week. So social things. So what does that look like a little more formally? Well, the type of framework we used is closely related and inspired by Matt Jackson's work, where you write down the traditional sort of economic tragedy of the commons problem, but you add in terms for the cost of applying social pressure and the effect of social pressure on peers. And so that incentive then is for people to bug each other, not for personal behavior. To give an example, I took a community near MIT, and together with my students, particularly Nadav Aroni and Wei Pan, we gave everybody smartphones and paid them to fill out surveys and stuff. And we're able to get in the high 90% participation in the community to let us look at essentially everything. about them that is digital, credit cards, health data, et cetera. And we did an experiment to get people to be much more active and healthy. And we had 3 conditions. One condition was the individual incentive. So on your phone, you had a pedometer, and if you were more active than last week, you saw some dollars accumulating to your account. A second condition was same thing, but now you could see some buddies. So we randomly assigned buddies from people that had been listed as close friends, and that's the peer C thing. So this is like many of the things that Fitbit does or O-Power, where there's a social pressure, but it's all implicit. There's no reward for it. It's just keeping up with the Joneses. And the third condition was like the red balloons or like the Swiss thing, where what we did is if you were more active this week, your buddy got some money. Okay? Your buddy could see what you were doing. Your buddies could see how many dollars he was making. And if you weren't being very active, of course, your buddy would talk to you about this. Right? And what we discovered was that the peer C one, like Fitbit does, like O-Power does, gave us twice the efficiency. So that's the change per dollar, which is good. But the peer reward one, where we rewarded the peers, gave us almost 4 times the efficiency. Huge effect. Huge effect. And people liked it. And this is essentially the thing that we're now using in several different places. So it's a very different way of thinking about things. It sometimes takes people a long time to sort of get this in their head, that when you reward people, you don't have to reward them directly. You can reward them based on their buddies or who they interact with most. And we'll say a little about that. This is also a fairly traditional way of doing things. So for instance, microcredit is done this way. You sign up for a loan and you have to get co-signers who promise that they will help you repay the loan. So you have social pressure to repay. And that's one of the reasons that microcredit is supposed to be so good at getting people to repay loans. There's a problem though, and that is that this peer reward mechanism is directional. So this is current work that we're doing. And what we found was in friendship relationships that were reciprocal, you got a very large amount of peer pressure applied. And if the person said they were friends with you, but you didn't say you were friends with them, then that was essentially that was also very good. I have to get this right. So when they think they're friends with you, but you don't consider them as friends, that works pretty well. But when you think they're friends and they don't think they're friends, that doesn't work at all. Has no significant effect. So it's directional, which is really interesting. Whereas the peer C one, where you can just sort of see other people, is not directional. So what this looks like is that the peer reward one is genuinely something of social pressure, where active interaction is required, and people who consider themselves friends of the other person are more willing to do this than the other way around. Whereas peer C seems to be more a pure contagion type of effect. And we've seen this in other things where we've seen BMI, happiness, all sorts of variables have contagion with people you're exposed to, even though you don't necessarily know them or you don't consider them friends. So when you write down these models that you're writing down and doing the research, you need to pay attention to 2 things. One is, if you're looking at a genuine contagion thing, which is not a conscious effect, so it's merely social learning, you can write down a friendship network. But it's really more of an exposure network than it is friendship. Okay? So you might want to not call it friends. And if you write down something that you call a friendship network, you better make it directional, because it depends on the directions. In one direction, it's not significant effect. In the other, it's a very strong effect. So if you go through the literature, you find that this mistake or this confusion is surprisingly common. So let me finish that bit up and then get into the next bit here. So just to sort of wrap this up, in this data, and now we've done surveys of the literature and found more than a dozen other cases, less than half of friendship ties are reciprocal. So when you consider somebody a friend, the odds are less than half that they consider you a friend. Think about this. It's true in every culture that we've been able to look at. And people are terrible at perceiving friendship. We are just rotten at it, okay? And this undermines efforts at collective action because, of course, the friendship relationship is what determines the peer pressure and the behavior change. So something to noodle about, and happy to talk more about that. So in the last couple of minutes here, I want to talk a little bit about privacy and data ownership. So over the years, we've built a lot of tools for empowering people. And this is based on something I call the New Deal on Data, which I developed for the World Economic Forum, where I ran a group that talked about privacy and possible policy solutions out in the world that included people like the Vice President of the EU and the Justice Commissioner of the EU and the head of the US Federal Trade Commission and people from the Politburo in China, as well as people like Chairman of Vodafone and CTO of Microsoft and so forth. And we've published these in various ways. We recently had something in Science that's attracting a great deal of heat. So we're very happy about this because it basically is wiping out a whole industry of so-called anonymization, which is sort of one of these things where you strip out the identifier and then send the data on. And turns out that there's a good-sized industry in this that we just put a knife in their back. But I'm proud of the fact that there's a recent court decision that outlawed the bulk collection of the NSA. So everybody knows about this. So the key technical thing that they cited was our paper. So I thought, yay, one for the crowd there. So we've helped various people around the world with this. So Bruno, who's here, runs the Mobile Territorial Lab. So we helped him with some of the basic software for data control and privacy, helping Sune also in Copenhagen. And just recently, we signed agreements with the countries of Luxembourg, Andorra, and Qatar to be able to do large-scale, countrywide experiments with interventions so that they could design a better country. So the idea here is that, you know, large fraction of the population in the country will get special software on their phones, special software where they can see their own data, and we'll do interventions like we did with the fitness intervention or the energy intervention, or also safe driving. So I think this is a different type of computational social science than you typically hear, because this is active. We are actually deploying stuff out in the field to hundreds of thousands to millions of people, and we are actually doing interventions that are real live interventions. They're not just experiments. But it's heavily instrumented, so that we can begin to ask what really works out in the field. We've done other things like this which are interesting. So in the last couple of years, we've helped Orange, the World Economic Forum, and the UN Secretary General Global Pulse Program release data for entire countries. So a couple of years ago, we had the D4D, Data for Development Program, where we helped with the data structures and the privacy aspects, and released data for the entire country of Cote d'Ivoire in Africa. How many people participated in this? Thank you for the participation. It's crazy that the rest of you didn't. This is the densest data set for an entire country ever released. We got 90 teams from around the world contributing papers on it, doing things like power systems, estimating poverty, looking at disease spreading, and so forth. This year we did Senegal again. The entire country of Senegal, all of the phone data, all of the financial data, all of the country data, all the data that the UN had. And the next one is going to be for the entire sub-Saharan African region. So you should watch for the next one. Just look at D for D and search for that. As part of this, and I know I'm sort of only a minute or two left here, this sort of work has attracted the attention of many nations and the UN Secretary General. So the UN ran a thing called the Millennium Development Goals for the last 15 years to reduce poverty, reduce infant mortality, etc. And they learned something which should sort of be obvious, but now they have the data, which is that if you don't measure it, it doesn't happen. So they did well on goals they could measure. They did poorly on goals that they couldn't measure. And so they're now beginning the next 15 years with 169 goals for things like ethnic violence and, again, infant mortality and so forth. And the commitment to be able to measure all these things using these big data computational social science tools that we've just talked about. So this report, which you should Google and sort of look at, is the declaration by the UN Secretary General. I helped put him together as part of that committee, called A World That Counts. And it's a commitment by all of the UN nations that their national statistical offices should develop these sorts of tools that you guys are doing to be able to measure these 169 parameters of performance for every country in the world. That's a pretty amazing thing. You might want to sort of get on board with that. So with that, I'm going to end. Thank you, Matt, for mentioning the book. There are copies of the book down there for students for free. If you haven't picked yours up, do it, because I'm going to give it to other people soon, okay? If you don't pick it up today, they're gone, okay? Thank you.
So we have time for some questions.
Right here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And so when I hear about the prevalence of these one-way relationships, as you think about, or as you call them, I'm wondering if they're more hierarchical relationships, where you have somebody, like when I was a professor, the students knew who I was, but I was having trouble keeping up with who they were.
So one of the main predictors of non-reciprocity is a difference in social status. So if you have a lot more in degree than they do, it's probably not a reciprocal relationship. Another predictor is embeddedness. And of course, another predictor, as you saw with the earlier work, is time spent together in more than one social situation, like, for instance, outside of work. So yes, those are predictors of things. But in the sort of data that I'm talking about, there are no hierarchical relationships. I mean, for instance, the one is a survey of 90,000 high school students, just the students. So that these are people that had spent many years together, and they were asked to list their friends in order. And then what you do is you compare the two lists. And what you find is more than half the time, the people that are listed friends by one person that list one person as a friend, the corresponding thing doesn't list them. A very interesting thing is if you look at these reciprocal friendships, you find that first-generation immigrants and disadvantaged minorities, so in the United States that's blacks, have less than half of the reciprocal relationships of other people. So what that means is they have a really stunning lack of social capital growing up. And that can explain all sorts of things. For instance, it predicts not feeling part of the community, not feeling part of the school, and of course it predicts academic performance as well.
Hi, so I had a question on the privacy.
Yeah.
So I agree, of course. I mean, we can do many, many wonderful things with data. I mean, and I'm convinced with that. But one of the issues is the centralization of this data in Facebook or, I mean, NSA or whatever. So do you think it's feasible or a good strategy to create systems where each person would own his own data? And decentralization would need some authorization, I mean, some consent of people. Is that technically feasible or not?
Yes, it's called a federated data system. People have been trying it for a while. We're sort of at the point where we can do it. What you've just put your finger on is perhaps the primary danger in my view. It's not such a danger here in Finland, but you can imagine what happens if there's a centralized database in Syria, for instance. What's going to happen? Bad things. You need to have a really distributed database. There are some real hopes for this. For instance, in Switzerland, there's now a cooperative which allows people and helps people own all of their medical records and helps them use their medical records to get personalized medical service. The UK is going to a similar type of thing where citizens own their data. The bad thing there is that they're going to put that database in one big computer someplace. They should scatter it around. And in the United States, the current administration is very much committed to decentralizing medical records. And if that happens, it's likely that other things will follow. So there's hope. Okay.
Any more questions? Well, let's thank Sandy again for an excellent talk. So we have a gift for you, Sandy. There you go. Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker is Dirk Helbing, who's a professor of sociology at ETH Zurich. He has his PhD in physics and is also affiliated with the computer science department there and really truly interdisciplinary in the theme of this conference. I'm sure many of you have seen his fairly innovative work on the dynamics and interaction of both pedestrians and vehicles. He's really developed the ideas of social forces and self-organization. He's doing some really exciting work these days with Living Earth Simulator, and very curious to see what he's got for us today in terms of the Nervousnet. So take it away, Dirk.
All right, good morning. The problems of the world are complex. We are faced with climate change, with financial crisis, with conflict and war. And so our world is actually exposed to existential threats. It seems that our conventional recipes don't work any longer, and that also our understanding of our complex world lags behind. So why is this? Well, if you look more closely into the problems that haven't been solved, then it turns out that the big unsolved problems of the world result mainly from systemic instabilities, I believe. This ranges from crowd disasters to traffic jams, for example. And the interesting thing about traffic jams is that they cannot be predicted even when knowing the thoughts of people. Why can I say this? Because there's a mathematical theory that tells us when traffic jams happen and why. Namely, when the density goes beyond a certain critical threshold, and then small variations in the speed will amplify. The next driver will respond with a delay. In order to compensate for this delay, he will trip the brake a little bit stronger, next one even stronger, and then finally cars get stopped, although no driver really wants this to happen. So systemic instability means that even if you have data, even if you have good technology and the best intentions, your system may get out of control. And this is happening also for many supply chains, in particular for the world economic system, where we have booms and recessions. Crime is another example where we have an unstable social dynamics, or the tragedy of the commons, situations where basically cooperation would be good for everyone. However, it turns out that cooperation is an unstable systemic state, as the free traffic flow is unstable. So it breaks down, it erodes, and we have a tragedy of the commons in the end. Conflicts are also the result of social instabilities. In particular, it turns out that sanctioning mechanisms don't work well in multicultural contexts. And also, finally, revolutions can be understood as the outcome of unstable systems. In order to understand these kind of problems better, a few years ago we came up with the Future ICT project, and actually we gathered people around the world to work on this project together, because many of the problems we're faced with are global problems and they can only be solved in a global effort. And in particular, it's very important to make an interdisciplinary approach. And this is why computational social science is so important, because it brings together social scientists with computer scientists and natural scientists. So this is really great, most needed. In fact, even though Future ICT wasn't funded in the end, it had quite some impact on what's going on in the world. And there are projects in a number of different countries, including the US, China, Japan, and also Russia. The latest country coming up with a related project is South Korea. And they're interested in working on opening up governance and having a participatory systems in which citizens are involved. Now, all of this has been driven by the availability of data. We are living in an age of big data. In just 60 seconds, we are generating 700,000 queries at Google, posting 500,000 Facebook posts. We're producing all sorts of location data, shopping data, and so on. And so the question is, could we build something like an X-ray for society to see what's wrong and heal it? So this idea is driving many people. And in fact, we can do that with some success. For example, we can measure the spreading of international tension. We can predict wars to some extent. That allows earlier intervention. We can predict epidemic spreading. And we can also predict nicer things such as global knowledge production, spreading of ideas, or even culture. The question is, what else could we do? And people have been asking, can we soon know everything? Or can we create a crystal ball that would see what's going on in the world at any place, at any time, or even predict the future? This was actually not the plan of Future ICT, but people are discussing these kind of things, and that's why I need to address it over here. Could one even run a country like a wise king or a benevolent dictator? And if one wanted to do this, then it was necessary, certainly, to manipulate people's choices. And that might be done with personalized information. So in fact, the question is, will we be remotely controlled? Or is this already happening? In fact, of course, we have personalized ads, and these personalized ads are intended at making our behavior change, make us buy certain kinds of products. And then the idea might be of some people that if your behavior cannot be changed the way the government wants it to change, then you could still use predictive policing. So the question is, I mean, that sounds a little bit scary, I guess, and that's why we need to talk about it. The question is, could such a society be built, and would we want to have such a society? And what are the alternatives? In fact, we're talking here about a cybernetic society, and this idea is pretty old. To run a society as a control system based on information, and that has been done by communist Chile many decades back. And it looked promising, but it ended badly, in particular for the president. And of course, we don't want similar experiment to end badly for our presidents and chancellors and so on. So we need to talk about, if we want to do it, and if you want to do it, then how to do it. So all of this is driven by the digital revolution. We have an exponential acceleration of processing power and of data and of artificial intelligence. And people are now talking about the possibility of superintelligence, are getting quite worried about it, as you have probably read on the news. We have companies called, for example, Recorded Future or Palantir that are really trying to predict individual people's behaviors. And in fact, in many cases, they're pretty good at that, can predict behaviors with more than 90% accuracy. And it seems that this would allow to predict the future of society, but we've done an experiment that actually shows this is not the case. Anyway, so there are experiments going on, for example, in Singapore, which considers itself as a social laboratory. And as we know, Singapore has had really large growth rates, and many countries are now asking, should we run our countries the same way? Or like China. And China has recently started a Chinese brain project. In fact, Baidu, the Google of China, has asked the military to join in a huge project. And the question is, what would it do? Well, for example, what it might do is to rate every single citizen for the behavior they're showing, including the behavior on the web. And the score you get would determine whether we can get certain jobs or not. So this is on the way. And people are talking about China as a model for other countries. In fact, some of this is already coming to our countries. For example, nudging, the attempt to use the technology used for personal advertisement in order to change your behavior. And that could even be used during elections, for example. Or pre-cops, which is predictive policing, it's there in Switzerland. However, powerful tools imply serious threats. And we need to be concerned because cybercrime is exponentially exploding. It costs us 3 trillion each year right now. It will be more in future. And in fact, every major company has been hacked, and also the Pentagon, the military, and everyone else. This is concerning, so we shouldn't have a lot of data in a central place. And also, mistakes will happen. Even the smartest superintelligence will make mistakes. In many cases, we'll learn afterwards whether a decision was good or bad. So we need to recognize that society cannot be steered like a bus, or even if you could do it, society wouldn't be functional anymore. We need to recognize that society is a complex system, like our body. And we know that more medicine doesn't help more. It would be poisonous to our body. So we need more wisdom rather than more power. And we need to learn how to be minimally invasive in order to get where we want. We also need to recognize that actually data volumes are exploding more quickly than processing power, and complexity as we go on networking the world is exploding even faster. So that means even though we have all this supercomputer power and all these data, we will lose top-down control, and we need to have a different approach, which is distributed control. So I personally believe that we need to focus on creating collective intelligence, which is a distributed intelligence that can handle the combinatorial complexity of the world. It can be adjusted to the problem. One of the biggest problems really when it comes to trying to optimize the world is the choice of the goal function, and no science is informing you which goal function to choose. Is it GDP per capita? Is it sustainability? Is it peace? Is it happiness? And that's why we need pluralism. If everyone does the same, then this could end in disaster. The other thing is that all of these data-driven approaches are nice, but they cannot predict what's happening after a systemic shift. It can tell you what kind of states have happened in the past. It can allow you to extrapolate, but a completely different state of society couldn't be predicted by this. But explanatory models could help you to some extent. So in fact, the best approach is combine some data with explanatory models. In fact, Google Trend has been celebrated as a huge success of big data analytics, but recently criticized because it's not really as good as expected. Instead, you can do the following, that you combine data about infections of people, as the World Health Organization is collecting it, with data about the air travel volumes, and that allows you to define an effective distance that allows you to understand the spreading process, as we've published in Science over here. But we can understand many more things. We can understand pedestrian flows and crowd disasters. We can understand traffic congestion. We can understand booms and recessions. I can understand also blackouts of power grids, what makes gas supplies resilient. And we can also understand opinion formation, social influence, coordination problems, cooperation, or the spreading of crime. Moreover, we can understand the evolution of moral behavior, which is kind of interesting, it makes humans special. And the evolution of social preferences. So why are we social in the first place? And the emergence of social norms and conflict. So there are a lot of papers. If you want to know details, then I'd advise you to read them. But then, I thought I would do that for the rest of my life. But then 2 years ago, I suddenly reduced my effort to model this world. And the question is why? Because I came to the conclusion that our world is to change dramatically, and partly because of the digital revolution that's going on, that's going to reshape all of our economic and societal institutions. And so we need to talk about design principles of our future world. This is what we need to work on. And in fact, I believe we can learn to understand the forces behind social and economic change. And as we start to understand these forces, we can learn that these forces work for us in the very same way as understanding physics has helped us to engineer systems. Now, the main success principle will be self-organization and the principle of the invisible hand. So what I personally believe is that we can create a world that works like magic. If we just come up with the right kind of interactions between system components in a complex system, then we can create almost any structure, almost any property, or almost any functionality. And the challenge for complexity science is to identify the right kind of interactions. And this can now be done. We can create feedback loops that would have the system behave in certain ways as we like it. But the idea is to control society not in a top-down way, but to have a bottom-up self-organization, to apply the subsidiarity principle enabled by an incentive system and a multi-layered approach. So the Internet of Things will make this possible. We will be able to measure the externalities, that means the external effects of our behaviors. And if we use this information and feed it back by means of a multi-dimensional incentive system, an exchange system, then basically we can let self-organization happen. So what do we need for this? I recommend a smart data approach, very similar to what CERN is doing. CERN is kind of the symbol for the way we should do science. So we make targeted measurements, and in fact, even though this is the largest civic big data infrastructure, they are throwing away 99.9% of all the data they measure. Why is this? Because they're just interested in confirming or falsifying a certain kind of hypothesis. And for this, they need certain kind of data. And all the other data is just noise for them. They're throwing it away. And depending on the experiment they're doing, they would keep other kinds of data. And rather than digging in notion of big data, we should make, as scientists, this targeted measurement approach. And for this, we would need to create actually the measurement devices. And in fact, this is now possible. So our smartphone actually is today's universal tool. I don't actually use it to make phone calls. And the most interesting thing is hidden inside, which is the kind of 15 sensors to measure almost anything. And there will be even more sensors in the future. What can we use this for? Well, we can connect those smartphones in order to build a global measurement system. But if you want to do this, we want people to use it and participate, and it's important that we build a system that we can trust. And that's why I advise to build this as a citizen web. If one company or one government would collect all the data that will be becoming available through the Internet of Things in the future, we couldn't do a step or say a word without being recorded. So I really think this should be created and managed by the citizens themselves. And it's very important that you are in control, that you can control what kind of data are being recorded and whether you're just using it for yourself or whether you're sharing it with others. And even after the data have been shared, it would be nice to have control of the data that have been produced. And for this, a personal data store could be used. It has been developed at MIT by Sandy Pentland's team. So what can we do with these sensor data? For example, we can measure acceleration. Here is the XYZ measurement of acceleration, and if just one smartphone is shaking, that could mean that you're mountain biking. But if all our smartphones are shaking at the same time, that would be an earthquake, and then it's time to warn your friends and family and colleagues to get out into a safe place quickly. So that sounds like a good idea, I believe, doing collective measurements all together. So why don't we do this and create a participatory real-time data infrastructure together? Of course, we could wait until somebody is giving us these data, but Google and Facebook haven't given their data to us until today. We might wait forever for this. So now let's create the data that we need and we want to have and that are important for the future of our society. Let's create this data ourselves. What are we waiting for? So it would work like Linux or Wikipedia or OpenStreetMap. We build the system together as an open participatory system. So the success principle is give and take. That means you can take the data that you need for your experiments, for consultancy, to create new products or come up with a new service. But for this system to work, you should also share some data back. And the same thing, actually, with the source codes. And that means that the measurement protocols that have been developed by others can be changed by you, because we might have 100 ideas what to do with this system, but you have another 100 ideas, and you have another 100 ideas. So if we put all these ideas together in one system, then we are going to create a very powerful information and innovation ecosystem together in a very short time. And that would actually foster exponential innovation. And that kind of exponential innovation will be needed to create all the jobs that will be lost in the next years in the classical sectors. About 50% of jobs will be gone, say experts. So the approach is to create new opportunities for everyone. And if set up well, then enabling users, customers, and citizens will lead to better services, better products, better businesses, better neighborhoods, smarter cities and smarter societies. And with a micropayment system, actually everyone could establish an own business. Well, this is not a dream anymore. This is already happening, and my Nervousnet team, young, dedicated people, have been working on this to make it happen. And in fact, the planetary nervous system can do a lot of things for us. It can do real-time measurement And this will allow us to create greater awareness of chances and risks of decisions that we might take. We might use the data in order to advance science, and also we can enable self-organizing systems and collective intelligence. So, for example, we could map noise in a city or in an entire country using the planetary nervous system. Or we could map luminosity. In fact, I will show you an experiment by the end of this talk. And we could create more awareness about the situation. We can create compasses for decision makers to measure not only GDP per capita, but also the state of the environment, health, social capital, such as reputation, trust, solidarity, or happiness. And we can also map crises or map resources and who uses them, or even the entire world in 3D using all the photos that people are anyway uploading about any place of interest in the world. So here are a lot of people who have taken photographs, and these were the points where the cameras have been pointing. If you put this together, then you can construct the Colosseum in 3D, and that you can do with any place in the world. So we can create a 3D copy in the digital world. So what I'm claiming here is that with the Internet of Things, the golden age of complexity science has started, because now we can come up with solutions and not just with descriptions. And here's one solution. It shows you that we can overcome this annoying stop-and-go traffic that we still have today. And so we'll soon see the reason for this annoying stop-and-go traffic as we elevate ourselves out of this car. And we're going to see that there is an on-ramp where some cars try to slip into the freeway, and that produces minor disruptions in the flow, and these are amplified. And as they're amplified, it creates this annoying stop-and-go traffic. Now assume that cars would be equipped with radar sensors. We did that, by the way, 10 years ago, long before people were talking about Google self-driving cars. Now, and these radar sensors would measure distance and relative velocities and drive your car automatically. Now, then this can increase not only comfort of driving, but also produce collective effects in the sense that it's increasing the stability of traffic flow and increasing the capacity based on local interactions, not central control. And it works even with 20% equipped cars, which is even more interesting. The same thing can be done for cities. When talking about traffic light control, we came up with a self-organized approach where the traffic flows are controlling the traffic lights rather than the other way around, based on local interactions again. And there are dramatic improvements, actually, for public transportation, improvements also for motorized traffic, and it's good for pedestrian cyclists too, and the environment. So we should really have this new approach enabled by real-time sensing, real-time data, and real-time feedback. And of course, for production, this is also extremely useful. The keyword here is Industry 4.0. So the question is, can we also build assistance systems for cooperation? And I personally believe yes. In fact, Elinor Ostrom has shown by empirical research that self-governments can be efficient given proper design principles. And it's our task to find these design principles. Reputation systems would be such mechanisms supporting social cooperation. Or a merit-based matching, which is not only good for people who cooperate, but increases the cooperation level altogether. Or competition, and in fact, compared to punishment, signaling is better and more efficient in many cases. Now, of course, in a diverse world, we need to create interoperability, and this will be done by digital assistants that each of us will use, and there are a number of them one can think of that will be fed by local data. And so, we're going to enter a new age of our society based on self-organization and real-time data and real-time feedback, And computational social science is going to deliver the solutions that we need in future. So get ready and join the Nervousnet community today, because this is going to produce massively increased efficiency. We'll have self-organizing, self-improving systems. It's based on a democratic principle of participation, individual autonomy of decision-making, and free entrepreneurial activity. But at the same time, it considers externalities, and that's why we will have fairer systems and better environmental solutions, and also more cooperation and less conflict. So let's do this together. And now, world premiere will show a small experiment. I hope it works. So please shut down your computers for a moment, and we'll soon shut down the light. I'll introduce Evangelos Pornaras to you, who is a developer of the Nervousnet. And we distribute a number of smartphones to people. Please, we need 6 people. Come forward. Actually, it would be good if you would stand over here. So thank you very much.
Okay, 2 teams, green and red.
Okay, so there are 2 teams, green and red. They're going to compete to catch light that I'm going to spend, with this flashlight over here, just to demonstrate that this is really working in principle. We need more phones. Oops. Hopefully I didn't do anything wrong. Team red. Team green. So, who is team green? Okay, team green. So let me just check it. So please hold the end towards the audience. So are we seeing, okay, team green, so there is a measurement impulse. And should be working too. And in fact, it's working, and now let's check out team red. And also this is working. So fantastic. So we're ready for the competition. Please get a bit closer and mix. I mean, we should have green and red mixed, and then you're going to compete to catch more light. Yeah, so this is just a small little funny demo of that we can now measure our environment with our smartphones. So, are we ready? I think it's not 50-50 at the moment. I need to feed, who's green? Okay, a little bit to be fair. Okay, good. Okay. No. Can we restart this? Green. Have a bit more green. Okay. Now, turn the light off, please. 3, 2, 0. So science can be so much fun. Oh, team B won. Oh, no more. All right, so that's it. Thank you. No more PowerPoint presentations. You keep it.
Thanks.
And Evangelos is going to give a talk about technical details tomorrow around 12 o'clock, so don't miss it. Yeah,
Ready for some questions now? So please raise your hand. People will come around with a microphone, and then you can stand up and ask a question. Your questions?
Sorry, but I'm not really sure what was the point of the experiment. Could you explain it a little bit?
This was about demonstrating that we can really use our smartphones as a measurement device now. And in fact, there are a number of features here. Feature one is we're not interested in what an individual person is doing. We're not interested in your private activity. We're aggregating data, and we're using sensors in a way that's not invading your privacy. For example, the microphone is not being used as a microphone, so we cannot hear what you're saying, but it's used as a noise sensor, and only if you turn it on, right? And in a similar way, we can use all the different sensors. So for example, the idea is that you could create your own applications and games. Could now switch the sensor from light to noise and make a noise competition, or you could change to acceleration and make a smartphone shaking competition, or whatever. I mean, these are funny applications at the moment, but it shows you there's this functionality. Now, it's you to come up with ideas how to use these sensors to measure the world and what you're interested in, because it's an open and participatory platform. It's open source even, and you can put your own applications on top of this platform and do your scientific experiments or create your own games, or whatever comes to mind, or your own company. So that's the idea, and this is just the initial demonstration that, in principle, this can go forward now as a community action. In fact, I'd like to invite you to establish Nervousnet hubs all over the world. It means small development teams that would join in the development of this infrastructure, which I believe will be important to run our society in a democratic way in future. So this is really important for a number of reasons. And it's going to solve many problems, not just traffic problems and production problems, but also societal and economic problems, potentially. So it's a really powerful new approach and gives us experimental possibilities now.
So it's definitely a oh, should I stand up? Okay, I'm right. I don't know where he's looking. This is definitely has awesome possibilities, but can you say a word about incentives? So how do you get people to actually do this? Why is the average person going to install this on their phone and start doing it?
Yeah, so first of all, I think saying people they should use it is not enough. That's why we are thinking also of these gaming opportunities, because most people want to have fun. Yeah, of course, scientists, besides having fun, also want to do other things with it. And so we are going to put incentive systems on top. We could do that together with you, micropayment systems, reputation systems, so you could collect points of different kinds for joining in, for providing data. And so there will be incentives, in fact. And one day, we might even run economic exchange on the basis of this joint system. So, it's not our system, it's all our system. This is how you should think about it.
Other questions?
Yeah. Thank you for the talk. I want to be a bit provocative.
Sure.
For the big problems of the world, you mentioned things like climate change and other things. Is measurement really the problem? The problems seem to be with policy making, right? With climate change, climate science they have some measurement problems, but not really the science. There is some consensus. And the same with if the problem is to save lives in an earthquake, maybe more than the measurement problem, buildings to earthquake code, having earthquake education, like in Japan compared to Nepal, that would save more lives than a cell phone that tells me, yeah, there's an earthquake,
Yeah, just think of the talk that Sandy Pentland has given, who actually inspired a lot of this. He was part of the Future ICT project and this idea to create a planetary nervous system. And in his previous talk, he has shown that this kind of approach can be used to improve energy use in environmental issues. So measurement is, of course, only one component of this. Awareness is something that we need to work on, and feedback systems, so incentives, as also Sandy has pointed out before, is really important. But you should see that as a detail of how we run systems in future. And I think we cannot just pass on all the responsibility to politicians to fix the system for us, because we see that this approach has limitations, and in particular because the methods that were available in the past haven't been able to reach out to the local places and find good solutions over there. So it will require our engagement in future to improve our neighborhood and our workplaces and our social environment. What has been missing in the past were tools for coordination, and that's why in the past the lower level activities were so difficult to arrange in a way that could really deliver solutions. And this is now changing. We'll have these coordination tools, and that will complement the activities of politicians and of businesses. So we'll fill the gap, and that's the idea.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for a very great. Santo has a gift.
Thanks.
Thank you. It doesn't work. No. It does. Okay, great. Okay. The other one is working as well. Okay. And I'll just use the one. Okay, so we have two speakers in our last session here. So we have Riccardo Fusaroli and Kristian Tylén, who will be talking about investigating conversational dynamics. So take it away, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And thank you to the organizers for putting together this splendid event. Yeah, so as Alex was pointing out in his morning keynote, a vast majority of presentations here approach various kinds of online and digital behaviors. However, we are particularly interested in a slightly different type of human interaction, that is face-to-face conversational dynamics, and we'll try to kind of thematize that or manifest that even in our way of presenting here, so we'll do a tandem presentation. So one of the kind of grounding assumptions for the work that we'll present is the idea that we can consider language as a cultural tool or technology that enables particularly sophisticated forms of social cognition and social coordination. So we use language in all kinds of ways to share knowledge and experience and emotions. We build and maintain social relations, teach each other, learn from each other, and what will be particularly relevant in this context is that we coordinate various kinds of joint actions using language, so we solve problems together, that kind of thing. But with that comes some questions. So what kind of particular aspects of our linguistics interactions actually facilitate joint performance in various forms of joint actions? So where should we look if we want to know something about like collective performance in, for instance, a context of problem solving? What kind of particular aspects of linguistic interactions are informative of collective performance? And the way that we will approach this is to ask about the particular level of linguistic organization that will tell us more about collective performance. So what do we mean by level in this particular context? I guess in the language sciences that we come from, often it's taken as kind of an assumption that language is a property of individual speakers and individual brains. So they would try and go to study linguistic, like individual linguistic contributions to learn about something like conversations. And it might very well be that going and studying these individual linguistic contributions can actually tell us something about performance in context of joint problem solving. However, there's also some ideas around about the way in which we adaptively pick up and use each other's linguistic structure. So the way in which we align the way we use language is actually facilitating understanding and collaborations. So the way in which we kind of build shared languages would be predictive of how well we do when we collaborate. Lastly, and I guess this would probably resonate with this crowd, it has been pointed out that sometimes we actually learn more about interactions if we approach it on a more systemic level, if we appreciate the way in which certain kind of types of linguistic organization actually emerge on a collective level, so that we can there see various structures and patterns that are actually not reducible to the individual contributions or individual inputs. So we might actually have to go and address linguistic structures at this kind of emergent collective level in order to really know something about the performance in various kind of joint actions. And let's see how we can kind of take these different ideas and turn them into more concrete predictions that we can use to go and test them in a corpus of conversation. So if we take the idea of individual linguistic behaviors, we could easily imagine that really if I want to make sure that you all understand me, one thing that I can do is to be self-consistent, to make myself predictable in a sense. That will help you follow along. So let's imagine that I'm introducing various concepts throughout this talk. So I might use a particular kind of concept or lexical item or syntactic structure, and the extent to which I'm self-consistent and reuse that, and maybe you also are self-consistent and reuse particular linguistic structures, that would kind of allow us to understand each other and thereby to collaborate better. That would be kind of one idea that kind of relates to the individual level here. However, we could also take as the starting point the idea of interactive alignment, which would kind of lead to predictions in terms of that the way in which we adaptively kind of pick up linguistic structures from each other and reuse those so that we gradually build up shared languages, that would be the predictive case here. So I would use a particular kind of prosodic contour, or a particular lexical item or syntactic structure, and the extent to which you would then pick that up and use it, or you might do the same and I'll pick that up and so on and so forth. That would be that kind of adaptivity to each other would actually be predictive of how well we would perform in various kind of contexts of collective actions. Lastly, let's look at the idea about interpersonal synergies. So the way in which any kind of structure that I would initiate is actually only completed by a particular response from you, creating these type of emergent patterns that actually straddle speakers and straddle speech turns. And we could imagine that if we had such kind of linguistic routines evolving through interaction, that would actually become a kind of systemic pattern, and the way in which those kind of repeat throughout our conversations, that would be predictive of how well we would actually perform in collective problem-solving context. That could be kind of a third prediction. And hereby I'll hand over the word to Riccardo.
Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So once that we have the three models that Kristian has just presented, how do we go and put them to an empirical and experimental test? So what we did is we chose a joint problem-solving situation involving diets for simplicity, and we measured language according to the three models and compared how well they predicted the joint performance. So this is how the experimental situation looked like. It's based on a study by Bahadur Barami, who was published in 2010 in Science, and there are two individuals who are looking at identical computers. They are presented with two psychophysical stimuli. They're Gabor patches, but the important thing is that in one of the two stimuli, there is a slightly darker patch. And then the two individuals have to indicate was the contrast oddball in the first or in the second stimulus. The computer then tells them, okay, you've chosen both the first one, and then we move on to the next joint decision, or if they chose two different stimuli, they are invited to discuss until they reach a joint decision. And then they get given feedback. And what crucially this affords us is not simply a measure of joint performance in terms of absolute accuracy, but it tells us what is the relationship between the joint performance and the individual performance, because a good collaboration is the one in which together we get more than what we would have gotten alone. So we measure it as the ratio between the joint performance and the best of the two individuals. This is how conversations look like. I don't have the time to go in detail through them, but basically the two participants exchange comments about how confident they are in their decision, and they use this information to establish which stimulus to jointly choose. And I guess here we reveal the kind of big data we're using, that is 16 pairs, 32 participants. However, that led to 1,470 short interaction and approximately 20 hours of video that looked very big data to our transcribers. So how did we deal with this data? So we took the raw speech signal, and from that we extracted 3 different time series, 3 different kinds of complementary aspects of language. The first one is fundamental frequency, which is indicative of prosody and pragmatic information. The second one is the sequence of speech and pause in the conversations, because pause and the use that we do of turn taking is very indicative of how fluent the interaction is and how new and old information is structured. And finally, we did an orthographic transcription of everything that was said. Orthographic means that it was written down in the way it's correctly spelled. Then, armed with these 3 different kind of data, we tried to measure coordination according to the 3 models that Kristian mentioned. So individual behaviors, interactive alignment, and interpersonal synergy. And we tried to do so in a way that would be comparable across the 3 models and across the 3 aspects of language. So we relied on a method that is called cross-recurrence quantification analysis, which I'm now very much simplifying. And if we look at the lexical coordination between 2 individuals, what we did is we took A's contribution, we put them on the x-axis, B's contributions, we put them on the y-axis, and then we look at where we saw repetitions between the contributions of the 2 individuals. And this gives us a recurrence plot, which allows us to quantify things like, for how long do people repeat each other's on average? So what's the average length of these lines? But also, what is the entropy of their distribution? So when we repeat each other, do we repeat each other's always with the same kind of units, words, or do we keep changing from words to sentence in a flexible way? And we applied the same method also to individual behaviors and the overall interpersonal synergy by simply putting the full contributions of A on both axes, for instance, and see how well A repeats himself or herself, or putting the whole conversation on both the X and the Y axis and see how patterned the conversation is. And this leads to this kind of plots. And you can very quickly capture that by looking at different aspects of language, you can capture different patterns of coordination. So how well do the indexes extracted from these plots predict the joint performance? Well, so if the way we're presenting it here is we're presenting the different aspects of language that we're looking at, and just as an indicative index, the Pearson coefficient between these indexes and the joint performance. And what you can see here is that if we just look at individual behaviors, we don't get much far. But if we look at interactive alignment, already we start having statistically significant predictions of collective performance, which are even better if we look at the interpersonal synergy model. If we then collapse the three different aspects of language, so lexicon, prosody, and speech pose into one model for the three different models that we're analyzing, again we get the interpersonal synergy seems to be the best at telling us information about the joint performance. So what we are trying to argue with this study is that interpersonal coordination relies on the establishment of interpersonal synergies, which can be routines to quickly solve problems distributing roles. And that language has in important ways to be considered as a relational phenomenon and not simply as a property of individuals. So that the dyad or the group should be more under the focus of analysis. And if you want to read more, we have a few papers. This study actually just came out in Cognitive Science, but we also applied this sort of approaches to heart rate and look at which traces that left on brain activations and at speech patterns in deception and conflict. And with that, we thank you and all our collaborators.
So we have time for a couple of questions. People. Question? There? Yes.
Thank you for your interesting talk. So my question is about how language is important for this experimental stuff, because more primitive information might be important, for instance, turn-taking or emotional expression, something like that. So how important it is?
How important it is to look at these fine-grained details? Okay. Well, so we run several studies, and this so far is the one that actually seems to have the highest predictive power towards joint performance. But of course, like all these forms of coordination might be also related to which task we're analyzing. What we are pretty satisfied with that apart from the transcript, everything else is automated. So it's something that is not, it's a bit computational heavy, but it's not excessively complex to calculate. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, so I think the important thing here is that also these kind of linguistic encounters are hugely context dependent, right? So it really depends on which kind of task people are solving together, where we would find, I think, the most predictive power. So you were, I think, asking whether we could imagine that even at more low-level measurements we would gain predictive power, right? And I think it depends a bit on the kind of task that people are solving together. So for instance, I don't think we would get a lot from respiration if it's some kind of really high-order cognitive problem that people are dealing with, for instance. But it's an empirical issue, of course.
Okay.
If nobody. I wanted to ask you, could you also take into account not only similar words, not only same words, but also paraphrasing? Because I know while in the communication, paraphrasing or using synonyms also, when you use synonyms, they're also similar words. Do you think you could also take into account in your studies?
So we're not doing this in this specific study, but it's possible to actually run, for instance, LSA measures on the transcript and then see how well that is mirrored or structured in routines across participants. And we would imagine that to be also an important aspect. We just haven't looked at that yet.
One thing that we did look at, and which is published in one of the other papers, like in a recent Psych Science paper, is alignment not at the kind of token level, like word-to-word level, but at the type level, so whether people use the same kind of overall clusters of words. So I think that's also kind of the direction you are taking there. So it don't have to be the very, very same lexical item, but it's a kind of an expression of the same way of conceptualizing maybe a particular kind of linguistic domain, and yeah, we have done some work on that, and that works. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Wodek from Poland. So my question is, do these people, could they see each other while talking? And if so, did you somehow maybe measure their, copying gestures or body language?
Yeah, so it was kind of, they were sitting in a darkened room, right? And they were giving these stimuli on the screens that were kind of hard. So we observed a huge variety of behaviors there. Someone would just stare at their screen and then talk, right? Almost keeping a back to each other. Or they were sitting at kind of at right angles, but not really like attending or dressing each other very much. Others were kind of laughing and did some gestures, but since those behaviors were so varied, we kind of gave up on trying to code it, and it seems that, at least for this particular task, it's mainly driven by their verbal behaviors, simply because some of our best groups were able to solve this or get a really high performance, even not addressing each other kind of in a bodily way, but relying only on the verbal cues.
And yeah, I would just add that, so as human beings, we're very expert interactors, and we are able to compensate for the very wide variety of situations in which we communicate. So over the phone, over Skype with terrible delays, face-to-face, on a noisy bus. So what I would suspect is that what we need to do is to do more multimodal analysis, where we look at different aspects. So here we chose 3, but we could have chosen others. We should never just focus on one, because people are very good at compensating. Oh, we cannot do this, so we'll use more prosody, for instance.
Okay, so thank you very much. We have coffee waiting, so.
Hold on to this. I think what happened